Phenomenology and Commodity Culture. This is my third video in a mini-series that focuses on exploring the relationship between phenomenology and our changing world. Whereas the first two videos were about meditative consciousness and technological consciousness, in this video, I'd like to explore phenomenology's relationship to commodity culture, especially as it exists here in the United States, but also with respect to our larger world, particularly insofar as I perceive that American commodity culture is fast becoming a kind of default value system for much of the globe. As with the two previous videos, my sources in this video will consist mostly of my own personal observations and life experience, but with some input from various phenomenological thinkers. To get started, I'd first like to explain how I think about commodity culture. At one level, it seems to me that commodity culture refers to the way our culture frequently circulates around materialism and its attendant values, such as those of productivity, efficiency, and practical expediency. However, at a more personally accessible level, it seems to me that commodity culture also has to do with the kinds of experiences that fill our lives, as well as the kinds of values we personally espouse. In this regard, I like to think of commodity culture in terms of two interrelated dimensions. First, in a commodity culture, a lot of our lives has to do with producing things on one hand, especially by way of our jobs, and then purchasing and consuming commodities on the other hand. So, one axis of commodity culture is defined by producing and consuming. At the same time, a lot of our lives has to do with being entertained on one hand, or being bored on the other. So the second axis of commodity culture has to do with entertainment and boredom. Taken together, these two dimensions form a two-dimensional template that maps out a considerable fraction of our everyday experience and values. Basically, a lot of our lives, and a lot of commodity culture, boils down to oscillating between production and consumption, and then between entertainment and boredom. However, our commodity culture also very much shapes our sense of self along the way, especially insofar as commodities are often designed and marketed to allow us to form our identities in one way or another. For instance, consider how the following sequence of products invites us to think of ourselves and to relate to others in a particular way. 1. Full-size Ford pickup truck. 2. Cowboy boots. 3. Blue jeans. 4. Chewing tobacco. On the other hand, consider how these products tend to code a very different sense of self and social engagement. 1. VW bus. 2. Birkenstock sandals. 3. Tie-dyed t-shirt. 4. Patchouli deodorant. Or these products. 1. BMW sedan. 2. Three-piece gabardine suit. 3. Rolex wristwatch. Of course, at first, it's tempting to think that we pick clusters of products like these simply because they're what we want. And at one level, they are. But the art of marketing is also about manipulating our desires by playing upon our more fundamental longing to be seen as a particular kind of person. We buy products not only because they fill our needs, but because we want others to see us in a certain way. And we want to see ourselves that way too. Basically, advertisers have known about this linkage between commodities and our identities for a long time, and it's been the basis of today's niche marketing for many decades now. However, as the great 21st century sage Tyler Durden has noted, the products we own also end up owning us, especially insofar as we tend to form our ideas about ourselves and our values according to their logic. All of this, of course, impinges upon the issue of authenticity and the authentic self, especially as articulated by Martin Heidegger. For Heidegger, authenticity revolves around Dasein's ownmost potentiality for being, as he puts it. In other words, authenticity isn't so much about sincerity or honesty as the normal English word might suggest. Rather, it's about orienting ourselves toward those possibilities that are most our own in this life. Inauthenticity, on the other hand, is about how we typically defer to das Man, to the mostly anonymous they whom we usually end up imitating, obeying, and following, typically at the cost of our own deeper possibilities. Here, Tyler Durden's observation about the nature of commodity culture returns to us in an even more vengeful arc. It's not merely that commodity culture affects our identities by reversing the dynamics of product ownership, enslaving us in the process. It's that we typically let its whole Weltanschauung become the primary boundary that defines our outermost possibilities and potentials. In such a world, it then becomes particularly difficult for us to hearken to the call of our being, to our deeper, more authentic possibilities in life. It becomes hard for us to be what we can be in this world when the entire landscape of possibility has been prefabricated, commodified, and shrewdly marketed to us ahead of time. Basically, to follow Tyler Durden's observation even further, our commodities end up owning us not only at the level of what we are, but at the level of what we think we can be. Beyond all this, though, it seems to me fairly obvious that a culture dominated first by the values of production, consumption, and entertainment, and then by a commodity-driven sense of self, would view the entire edifice of phenomenology with considerable suspicion and distaste, which seems to be pretty much the case today. After all, it's hard to see how phenomenology's project meshes harmoniously with the predominant values of our culture. First, in comparison to other modes of inquiry, such as, say, psychopharmacology, phenomenology doesn't seem to offer much that translates into immediately practical application in the marketplace. That's because phenomenology's project basically has to do with awakening and self-awareness rather than monetary profit. Basically, phenomenology isn't about worshiping the gods of the marketplace. Its value plays out along a completely different dimension, namely, that of helping us awaken to the reality we're inhabiting. However, it's probably not adequate simply to say that phenomenology and commodity culture operate according to different sets of values and hence have different teloi. The deeper difference lies more at the level of Weltanschauung, at the level of the fundamental direction of our lives. From a phenomenological perspective, things like productivity, consumption, and entertainment are, of course, inevitable parts of the human experience. But in the final analysis, they're really just part and parcel of the natural attitude, the assemblage of common assumptions that we would do well to bracket if we really want to understand our experience. In other words, they aren't really the main point of our lives, as is often assumed from the perspective of commodity culture. Rather, the main point of our lives is to awaken to the reality we're inhabiting, to understand it, at least partially, and then hopefully to expand our awareness and to deepen our experience of life. And as a side note, we should probably also say that in addition to these differences in values in Weltanschauung, the kind of ethics that would derive from a phenomenological approach are very different from those proffered by a commodity culture. From the standpoint of commodity culture, the good in life has mostly to do with being productive, efficient, and profitable, and then enjoying life by way of owning and consuming products. In contrast, from a phenomenological standpoint, the good is to understand life in terms of our experience of it, and thereby to expand our awareness and deepen our experience at both the individual and social levels. Personally, I believe that there are many roads that can lead us to the core of life, and there's nothing in principle that prohibits materialism and commodity culture from being one of them. In fact, for some people, perhaps a substantial dose of all of that is exactly what they need as they travel along life's road. Perhaps in much the same way that Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha needed to experience a prolonged and ultimately sickening phase of materialism in order to move toward his deeper destiny. However, for other people, it may not necessarily work that way. For those kinds of people, what would be optimal would be to follow a path of becoming aware of experience and gaining some phenomenological understanding of it. And this is where commodity culture becomes somewhat problematic, at least from my own estimation. The problem isn't with commodity culture or materialism per se, which in the final analysis is simply another form of life, another thing for us to experience. The problem is with the totalizing tendency consumer culture often embodies and engenders, a kind of exclusivity that makes it seem like it's the only worthwhile game in town, or even across the entire globe. As the adage goes, he who dies with the most toys wins, which would seem to be a kind of shibboleth for our time. And against that kind of backdrop, an endeavor like phenomenology can't help but seem at least a little ridiculous and unprofitable, in much the same way that commodity culture can't help but appear like a relatively trivial expression of the natural attitude from a phenomenological perspective. And this status quo would be straightforwardly acceptable if it weren't for the fact that in an era dominated by profits and productivity, there's very little room for the whole phenomenological project of understanding and deepening our awareness. And the upshot is that those of us whose better destiny would lie along phenomenology's road are left to muddle along, trying desperately to adapt ourselves to a culture whose values and direction neither suit us nor beckon us toward the center of what our lives could otherwise be. Vaguely haunted by the ephemeral wraiths of our lost dreams and misplaced possibilities, thirsting always for another life, a life shimmering like a restless vision beneath the prosaic moments of our lives, we move from day to day through an endless topography of commodities, secretly yearning for a deeper poetry in a deeper world, the phenomenological poetry of experience itself.